Hey there, I'm Frank, host of Reader's Labyrinth. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeffery Kripal. Kripal holds the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. I learned about Kripal while listening to the podcast Where Did the Road Go? And I bought his book, Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superhero Comics, and the Paranormal. His book opened the door to a strange universe, and one I've been caught up in ever since. I delightfully followed Kripal's argument of how the divine has intersected reality and pop culture, thereby crafting a meta-narrative about where we're headed into the future. Mutants have lived rent-free in my head ever since. Pushing further down the rabbit hole, I discovered another personality not unfamiliar to followers of the paranormal, Whitley Strieber. I found Kripal's authorship with Strieber in The Supernatural, A New Vision of the Unexplained, a book that was thoughtful, self-reflective, and it forever planted the idea that reality is stranger than we could ever imagine. Jeff's current book, The Super Humanities, is published under Chicago University Press and came out this year of 2022. His premise is that the humanities, history, philosophy, comparative religions, art, and literature all possess super knowledge, which was gleaned through altered states of consciousness. Kripal posits that most of human progress is the result of superhumans who've developed super abilities to see outside the restraints placed upon them by time, space, language, and culture. This torch is today carried forth by innovators in the fields of critical race theory, activism, queer studies, and post-colonialism. My personal litmus test for anybody claiming to be an expert in the field of high strangeness is I like to ask them, are they familiar with Kripal? If the answer is yes, then I know I'm in for one hell of an engaging conversation. You'll find links in the show notes, so please consider buying Jeffery Kripal's The Super Humanities. And now, let's hear what the man himself has to say. Please remember to like and subscribe to Reader's Labyrinth. It really helps. Dr. Jeff Kripal, welcome to Reader's Labyrinth, sir. How you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Frank.
Awesome. And Rice University's in Texas, right?
We're in Houston.
Houston. Okay. I had a late grandmother that lived in Corpus Christi, Texas. We used to make our yearly little pilgrimage to Texas, so I definitely remember the ride there and going through Houston.
Corpus Christi is south and east of us. I mean, it's down on the coast, towards Mexico.
I like how you almost made a cross. It's south and you go east to east to Mexico. Well, thank you for agreeing to come on here. I am a really, really big fan of your work. I've read Mutants, the Supernatural that you co-authored with Whitley Strieber, and the one that our readers need to go and pick up, the Super Humanities. Great stuff. So I would like to start us off with some general, some questions about your background. Okay. We can start off with there. Okay. So the first question I have, kind of based on the research I was doing, is when I was conducting research for this interview, I saw that your publishing career goes as far back as the 90s. Then I read that you've been pursuing spiritual and intellectual pursuits back when you were 14 years old. I think I got that off of your webpage.
Yeah.
So there's something in the blood. What is it?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. There's something in the blood, as it were. I was super uber pious as a young man. I was more pious than you can imagine, Frank, and probably that was good for me or anyone else. But I got really religious, as an adolescent, and I stuck to it. And of course, that religiosity has shifted and morphed over the years. But I've always had these religious questions about life and each other and what the heck we're doing here.
Well, so when you say that you were a really pious young man, was this something that was mainly in your teenage years? Did it drag out into your 20s, or what did that look like?
Well, by pious, I mean Roman Catholic pious. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest in Nebraska. When puberty was the time that I became super pious, and I do think it was linked to sexuality, frankly, but in a kind of unconscious or sublimated way. I also became very anorexic, by the way, at the same time. I stopped eating. And the word didn't even exist. Karen Carpenter didn't die until, I don't know, 81 or 82 maybe. And she died of anorexia. And then, of course, we all knew the word. But I was anorexic in the 70s already. And, of course, it was mostly young women. It wasn't young men. So I was a kind of a double mystery, as it were. But that set me then off on this path of trying to figure out, well, why I was so religious and why I wasn't eating and what was going on and what's this thing called sexuality. And, that led me down a series of rabbit holes, as it were. And that's what eventually brought me to the study of religion and a kind of intellectual life.
Well, that's really fascinating. And when I was also reading your introductory essay, you said on your website, again, as you just told us, my life has taken me from Roman Catholicism and Benedictine monastic spirituality. I'm really, really fascinated by that. And excuse me, what took you away from the monastic experience? And what have you taken from that experience, if anything, that is sticking with you today?
Yeah. Yeah, no, the Benedictines were profound. They're still profound. I think what I received from them that has definitely stuck with me is this idea that learning is sacred, that study is a kind of religious practice, and that God and truth are not incompatible. You can use your mind and pursue any intellectual pursuit you see fit, and the results of that cannot possibly contradict with whatever God is. That was really instilled in me in that undergraduate education. I think I first awoke to it. It was a class called Christ in the New Testament, and it was sort of classical historical criticism applied to the Gospels, and I was just blown away. I was just a kid, Frank. I was just a kid from Nebraska, which meant I knew nothing about historical criticism. But what was so stunning to me was the message that I could use my mind. We could use history and translation, sociology and anthropology. We could use whatever we wanted to try to understand what was going on in these scriptural texts. And I also remember the class basically split in two. It was guys who were offended and horrified by the class, and guys that were liberated and stunned by it in a positive way. And of course, I was on the latter. So that was sort of the realization that you could combine these things and that they were already combined, whether we did it or not. What took me away? That's a complex question. This is not the fault of the Benedictines, by the way. I think what took me away was the institution of celibacy and the realization that sexual orientation was a really big deal, and that celibacy selected out for essentially a kind of gay sexuality and spiritual life. And I happened to not be so put together, and so I just didn't fit in. It wasn't and I'm not saying an act of sexuality. Celibacy is celibacy. That's not the point. The point is that I just didn't fit in, and so it was a kind of loss, and it was a kind of automatic exile, as it were. And so, but it wasn't. There wasn't any judgment there. There was no personal seedy dimension to this. It was just a kind of loss, really. And I went to graduate school to study religion. It was a kind of backing into the academy. It was my joke is the academy is the only institution that would have me. And, there's a lot of truth to that. And there really is no other institution in our culture that encourages people to ask critical questions about religion. There's lots of institutions that tell us not to do that, but there aren't many. There aren't many that say, "Go ahead, do." Not only go ahead and do that, but hey, we will actually hire you, and we will reward you, and we will keep encouraging you. I mean, to me, that's just really remarkable, and so I'm extremely grateful for that. Even though a lot of my peers and colleagues, of course, didn't get jobs and didn't get in, and went on to do other things, of course. So there's an issue of luck here. There's an issue of serendipity. There's an issue of just this is what happened.
Yes, the historical criticism, that's something that can really make or break a person, I think, because no matter how methodical you are, what your IQ level is, your background in piety or spirituality, you're going to have your worldview broken. Yeah. And it's how you put those pieces back together again is what's going to happen. But speaking of worldview being shattered, Jeff, I've heard you say elsewhere that a person must have their worldview shattered a few times before they can get a sense of themselves and ask the truly big questions out there. Yeah. As a professor, mentor, teacher, do you find that your students who choose comparative religion have their worldview broken already?
Yeah, I do. What I say is that you have to have lost at least two worlds. And the reason I say that is if you've never lost a world, you're comfortable in your birth culture and your birth world, which is great, good for you, but you're not going to be sympathetic or interested in other people's worldviews. And if you've lost that first world, the chances are very high you've just converted into another one. And that other world might be science and technology and, a kind of secularism, by the way. It's still a world that you convert into. Once you lose that second worldview, or once you begin to question it or answer all the questions, and you suspect they won't. And when you pull back from landing, it's at that point I think you become a real intellectual and you begin asking the big questions, as it were.
On that topic, can you explain to us what comparative religions are, I guess, as a topic in academia?
Well, comparative religion is a phrase, and it simply means the study of all religions, looking at their histories and their stories and their rituals and their practices and their institutions, and not privileging one of them over the other. In other words, we don't study Asian religions privileging, say, Christian theology, but we also don't study Christianity and Judaism and Islam privileging, say, Buddhist philosophy. We try to put everything on an even table and then develop categories that don't presume one of those particular worldviews. And by the way, that's very hard to do. And usually what ends up happening, of course, is the presumption, the sort of dial set, as it were, is some form of historical materialism or secularism, which allows you then to look at all these religious worldviews, but of course is its own set of assumptions and its own worldview. And hopefully the religions will challenge that, but certainly not always. So it's hard. But the comparative religion is simply a phrase that means that you're studying all religion and you're doing it comparatively in a fair and even fashion, and you're not privileging one over all the others.
That's probably the simplest explanation of comparative religions I've ever heard. I really like that.
Good.
So speaking of comparative religions, I would like to ask a question that involves a former professor of mine when I went to the University of South Carolina, the late and great Dr. James Cutzinger. He was a professor in the study of religion department, and he mentioned to me one time when we were having our one-on-one advisement that the most ardent anti-spiritual hardliners of all are in the humanities themselves.
Yeah.
And they self-select employment positions for fellow hardcore skeptics like themselves. And then he went on to explain that he was most welcome and at home in some of the STEM colleges, and he has had conversations about paranormal events, UFOs, and just plain uncategorizable weird stuff with professors and researchers from those areas. So I guess my question, as an outsider looking in, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. I'm not trying to get you in any kind of heat at Rice.
I'll try to answer it. I'll blab about anything, Frank. Whether
awesome.
The answer is convincing or not, I'll give it my best shot.
Well, there we go. So the question is, what is it about the humanities that is so chock full of people who just seem to hate any idea of a transcendent reality?
Yeah. So there are some really good reasons for that position, and I think there are some bad reasons for it. The good reasons, and by the way, I often say I love humanists, by which I mean I really do. I mean, I really think humanist intellectuals who take this position you're describing are some of the finest people on the planet. And their rejection of any kind of transcendent dimension or religion as a whole usually comes from a deep moral position. And it also comes from the historical knowledge that religious communities and religious institutions have done a great deal of harm to people in the past, particularly people in minorities or outgroups. And so there's an automatic suspicion of transcendence or religion as just more oppression and more exclusion and more bigotry. So I think that's the main reason. And I think that's actually a very plausible reason. I mean, I understand that. Where I think it becomes really problematic, and I think Professor Cutzinger would have chimed in here, is when you sit down with people and when you listen to their stories, they will often tell you experiences of transcendence that actually have nothing to do with this secular materialist worldview we're talking about. And these are often the most important and moving and transforming experiences of their whole lives. So to ignore those or to say that they didn't happen is actually an act of violence in itself. And I think it does tremendous damage to the broader culture and to the public conversation. And I think it just feeds into this stereotype that intellectuals are just pricks, essentially. You know, we just don't care, and we sort of isolate ourselves in ivory towers, and we don't really understand what's going on. None of which is true, by the way. But I think, or I worry, that this refusal to struggle and deal with religion is part of the problem, and certainly not part of the solution.
I really like your word choice there. And you said it's a kind of violence against religion because anyone who shares those same stories are kind of cast into that negative light almost.
Well, it's a kind of violence against people. I don't actually believe there's no such thing as religion out there. I mean, it's impossible to do violence to religion because religion's not a person, but it's very possible to do violence to a person and to shame that person, to silence them, and to marginalize them. And that's really what concerns me here. So I'm trying to use the moral place of humanists to make them even more moral, or to make them even more caring about what's actually going on in the world. So I think their instincts are correct. I just think they don't go far enough, and they don't carry through on their compassion or their sympathy.
Well, that certainly answers the question for us. It's just part of being human, and I guess all of us are going to be shaped by the culture and background that we have. And I imagine a lot of the folks in the humanists are no different, of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're strange beings, and weird things happen all the time to us and with us and in us. And I think what happens certainly in the academy is that those things are just shoved aside and not talked about. And I think that's a shame, actually. I think it's a kind of is very unscientific, to be blunt about it, but it's also very unhumanistic. It's a refusal to really consider the full depth and scope of what a human being is.
And not only that, but it's almost like we want reality to be a certain way. And like, if you look at the adherents of Pythagoras, and they hated the idea of imaginary numbers and infinities, and they were trying to like create this perfect mathematical formula, I guess, but they kept running into this weird stuff, you know, because the universe is strange. And I kind of sense like, I'm not sure, you know, cult mentality is a horrible bastardized term to use, but anything that could suggest that reality is other than exactly what they think it is, they absolutely do not want to consider the possibility of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the better term there is ideology. I mean, people work with an ideology, and it's largely unconscious, by the way, Frank. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that the religions are somehow innocent and free of this either. They're not, of course.
For sure, yeah.
And that's what, again, takes us back to the word comparative. I mean, to be truly comparative is to understand and to embrace all of these criticisms. But it's not to embrace any particular religious system or belief system either. It's to sort of sit in the middle of all of this and to keep asking questions and to keep trying.
This sounds like a great segue for the next question. So, what are your thoughts on the slow trickle of government admittance that A, you knew I was going there.
Oh, this is going. Go ahead.
That A, UFOs exist, and B, that these entities, whatever they are in our atmosphere. Because you want to talk about a reality challenging event, I think, and something that the folks who think reality is one way are being confronted by facts that are showing, hey, it could be something else. No right or wrong answer. Just wanted to know what you thought.
Yeah, no. I get asked that a lot. So, you know, this conversation changed dramatically in December of 2017 when the New York Times published a couple essays kind of revealing that the U.S. government had these secret research programs for a long time. And these radar videos were actually leaked. I think released is too neutral. They were leaked.
They were doing everything to get ahead of the narrative on that too.
Yeah. And since then, there's been a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion of this in the media and the military and even in Congress. But here's the thing, Frank. All of that conversation has taken place on a very technological or military or nationalistic level. These things, these presences in the sky keep getting framed as potential threats. And this is what I call the Cold War invasion narrative. You know, we've been in this Cold War for decades, and so anything in our skies that we can't control becomes a threat, becomes an alien. You know, the alien is the dangerous other that's invading our space. You know, what no congressional panel will actually deal with, or certainly the Air Force won't deal with it, is that if you look at this research that the government sponsored, it's filled with paranormal effects. It's chock full of spectral monsters showing up in the backyard and hitchhiker poltergeist effects affecting the researchers and orbs of light probably causing cancer. And I mean, it's scary, but it's also not just technological. It goes so far beyond that, it's not even funny. And people will not talk about that. They just shove it aside. Oh, that's the crazy stuff. That didn't happen. Well, it did happen. And it's part of the government research that has not been released yet, but has certainly been written about. And so I think it challenges people's reality, but what they do, Frank, is they just shove it back into their reality, you know? And I wish they'd stop doing that, frankly.
One of the literary allusions that you did in your book, The Super Humanities, as you describe the government top-level security clearances around the UFOs, it's almost having like this occult dimension to it. I mean, you have to be initiated into the government structure. They're giving you a little bit of this esoteric knowledge of the UFOs. And there's just something so, I don't know, Coast to Coast AM Illuminati vibes to this whole thing that's going on.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Diana Pasulka, who's a good friend of mine, a fellow scholar of religion, she talks about the UFO as a religious phenomenon. And she means a lot of things by that. But one of them is that esoteric discourses and secret communities tend to form around the phenomenon. And what Diana's trying to point to is that religion has always been an elite phenomenon. It's always been specialists or highly educated men, usually, who have claimed some knowledge, and you can't get to that knowledge unless you do X, Y, and Z. And then once you know that knowledge, then you're somehow special or set apart. What's happened with the UFO phenomenon is the military and the intelligence communities, in this country at least, have wrapped a series of confidential programs and disinformation campaigns around it. And so frankly, we don't know what's what. And the first thing I would say to anybody looking at radar returns or anything, certainly anything on the internet, is beware. Don't believe what you're seeing because it's likely a trick. And I also know, just as a simple kind of researcher or professor in a humanist discipline, rule number one is that when I cite some other research or some piece of information, I better darn well give you a footnote, and I better darn well tell you where I got that, so that you then can go to that essay or book or website and read the same thing I did and come to your own conclusions, which might be different than mine. That's rule number one. That's what research is it's a public conversation and a free flowing exchange of information and ideas. If there isn't such a free flowing exchange, there's no research, there's no conversation. And so the first thing I noticed about this UFO thing is that none of that exists. In fact, there are multiple hurdles put up that, no, you can't see this, no, you can't research this, no, you don't have these security clearances. So we're not going to figure this out, Frank, because there are political structures in place that are preventing us from figuring this out. But I don't think that's any different than it's ever been. That's kind of what I want to say. I'm not blaming the U.S. government here. I'm not blaming the military. They do what they do. They probably have very good reasons for doing it. But the result is you're not going to figure this out. And I'm not convinced, Frank, that they know what's going on either. That's kind of the trippy sort of conclusion is, I don't believe for a minute that there's somebody in some agency that knows the secret and they just aren't telling. I don't think they know. And so I think that the levels of ignorance just kind of compound over and over and over again.
So are you familiar with Professor Avi Loeb, who's head of the Galileo Project?
I was just with Avi actually 2 weeks ago.
No way. What? Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think he's trying to solve this question. I know with the Galileo Project, he's raised a bunch of money. He's bringing in some powerful minds into it, a bunch of technical expertise. And I think his central thing is he's trying to make the information that they gather public. And he was on the Event Horizon YouTube channel not too long ago. And he was kind of talking about the methodology by which they will select sites to look at. But there is an effort, at least in the civilian side of things, to try and take a stab at this.
So, let me say something about that. And I said this to Professor Loeb, so there's no secrets here. I think what he's doing is excellent in the context of the sciences and the astronomical sciences that he's working in. But it remains a very materialistic kind of enterprise. And when you try to, again, push this inquiry into these weirder paranormal aspects, I think that's where the Galileo Commission will back up and say, no, that can't be replicated, that can't be measured, we're not going to go there. And I'm like, okay, I know it can't be replicated, I know I get all that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening and it's not part of the phenomenon. So I think the Galileo Commission's great. I think what it does is really necessary. I don't think it'll be sufficient. I don't actually think UFOs are machines in the sky, by the way. If you really, as I joke, if you give me enough beer, and I hesitate to say that because one podcaster actually sent me a box of beer.
There you go.
And he spent way more money on postage than the beer, by the way. So don't do that. Don't do that. But, you know, at the end of the day, I don't think they're machines in the sky. I think they're occult, or they're spiritual, or there's something we don't even have a category for. Maybe they are machine-like and they're occult. You know, I mean, we just don't have a way of thinking about this because they just blow up all of our categories. And I'm just really struck by how basic and inept and inadequate our categories are here.
It is a wonderful example of where our ability to intellectualize and encapsule a problem just collapses. Like you're saying, it just blows away all of our categories. And that's what's so fascinating about the UFO, the phenomenon for the wider public as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, these same professors like Avi Loeb, if, you know, whenever I was watching him in Event Horizon, you can get him to a spiritual plane. You can get him to a non-material. All you have to do is talk about Kardashev level 7 civilizations. Hey, we've advanced so much. We've transcended physical reality itself, and they get into interdimensional stuff. And hey, this could explain why we can't measure this and that. But to me, at that point, if your civilization is so advanced that you become gods, as essentially, then you're already in the realm of religion. And yeah. I'm just haunted by the words of Whitley Strieber in one of his books. And he said, this has something to do with death.
Yeah.
That was
actually Anne who said that.
Anne, his late wife. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's essentially what I think too. And I mean, Anne was deeply influential on my thinking there, but I think I probably came to that parallel. Carl Jung said that already back in the late 50s. And the way I would put it is, all this military government stuff, I mean, you might as well be trying to shoot down souls. It's not going to work because you're mixing categories, and you're doing something very physical and very violent to something that is not physical and not violent, by the way, or usually not violent. So we don't know. Again, we just don't know. And when Anne said, I think this has something to do with death, the context there is she was kind of coming out of reading hundreds and if not thousands of letters that Whitley had received for writing Communion in 1987. He made the mistake of putting his address at the back of the book, and he thought he'd get a couple dozen letters. Well, he got a couple 100,000. And it was Anne who took it upon herself to read all those and to think about them. And the motif she was thinking about was often in an alien abduction, dead loved ones show up with the alien, which of course isn't going to happen if it's from some other star system.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, if it's a von Neumann probe, why would it do something like that? It just makes absolutely no sense. Like you said, the terrestrial explanation just breaks down. I mean, it just does not hold up at all on that level.
The other thing Anne said that I think is very wise is, and Whitley often quotes this too, she said something like, we're too young for beliefs. What we should have now is better questions. And again, that's a very intellectual or nerdy thing to say, but I think it's basically true. Because once you believe, and I don't care what you believe, Frank. Avi Loeb believes too, just like the abductee believes. But once you believe, you have landed. You've decided that this is the answer. And so what Ann meant is, don't do that. Don't land. Keep asking questions and let the questions get better and better, but don't land because you'll stop asking questions.
I love that. It's the perfect, I guess, epistemology for understanding this, just asking the questions. And the more, the UFO phenomenon, all explanations break down, like you're saying, and just keep asking those questions. And that's beautiful. So I was wondering about the sigil. Excuse me, I'm getting over a little head cold here. The sigil on your work, Mr. Jeff. I'd like to know, where did it come from? A little bit of the backstory. And for our viewers out there, if you guys buy his book, you can see it. I believe it's right here. I'm going to hold that up. I believe that's what I'm looking at. I think I saw that in Mutants and Mystics, sir. I saw it in there. It's kind of appearing here and there.
Yeah. The backstory on that. So it looks, people tell me it looks very Star Wars-ish. That is not what I was thinking. It's a kind of circle with a kind of a horn coming out of it. It looks like a circle with wings and a horn coming out, as it were. There's a lot of backstory there, which I have not told, by the way, Frank. I'm not sure I want to tell all of it, but some of it is when I wrote a book and came out 2001, and it's called Roads of Access, Palaces of Wisdom. And it's on the mystical experiences of scholars of mysticism. Again, it's kind of this attempt to say, hey, look, these intellectuals are actually also mystics, and they're writing out of their own experience, just like they're writing about experience. And I created that sigil in that book because that book's also filled with my own autobiographical journal entries, and I wanted to walk my talk, essentially. I didn't want to just talk about other people. I wanted to say, look, the same is true of me. It's probably true of you, too, by the way. And so a gentleman named Jody helped me with that. I drew it on a napkin, actually, literally drew it on a napkin, handed it to Jody, who's a graphic designer, and he created the sigil for me on his computer, and then I shared that sigil with the press. And we've used it now in 3 books, Roads of Access, Mutants and Mystics, and the Super Humanities.
Well, thank you for that very succinct explanation on it. And that was a question that had come up in some of the comments on some of the videos when I was researching this. And I believe that you have a very brief, I think a paragraph or 2 in the Super Humanities where you talk about your sigil as well. So,
yeah, the other thing I'll say, Frank, I don't mean to. No, I don't ever want to bounce back a question, so I won't try to answer it. But early on, when I was a young man, and I was young, and I didn't look like this, and I think I was probably 20, maybe. I had a very significant dream that ended up saving me from anorexia, but also kind of set me on a different path. And it involved a flaming unicorn, essentially, is what it involved, that was in the water. And so the notion of a horn and something holistic and a kind of both and, it's male, but it's also female at the same time. And yet there's a horn there, there's something phallic there. All of these things are sort of coded in that sigil. And the reason that's significant is, again, the origin of that sigil was this book on the mystical experiences of scholars of mysticism. And I was telling my own story in the process. So I felt it was important to include there. And then it just seemed right to use it again and again. The press liked it. They really used it in Mutants and Mystics. Oh my gosh, it's everywhere. So that's the story behind it.
There's something almost hypnotic about it, and I really love the origin story for it. And it seems like a big theme in your work, Jeff, is just kind of following these little strange little promptings and them kind of manifesting themselves out there. And I kind of like it. It's almost like a secret code. Like, I picture myself walking down a dark alley. I'm looking for the secret symbol on the door. The moonlight's just right. I'm like, there it is. That's where I'm going to drink the beer with Jeff. He's in there.
Yeah.
Come in with the case.
A sigil, of course, for your listeners who don't already know it, a sigil is a magical symbol, usually abstract, that's drawn and used in a magical ritual to conjure or materialize some wish or desire. So again, I felt it was really appropriate to use in a book because that's what you're trying to do as a writer. You're trying to get your readers to materialize whatever it is you're saying. And, I believe that. There aren't many things I believe or I say I'll believe, but magic is one of them. I think intention and will and mind are something that can actually materialize in physical reality and social space. And so when I use that sigil, it's not innocent. It's playful, but it's also serious,
I really like that. And you say that magic is what? It's intention, will, and intellect. Was that what you said?
Well, for me, what magic is this resonance or this correspondence between something subjective in the mind, will, intention, mind, that then resonates or has some correspondence with a physical event, some historical event outside the person. So there's this inner, outer, or subjective, objective parallel thing set up, and which actually I think sometimes has real effect. And so that's really what I mean by magic, is that capacity to make real what one is imagining. Let's put it that way.
You see, there's that secret occult again. I like that. The secret meaning behind
absolutely.
It is creeping up, isn't it? That is awesome.
Yeah, occultism is cool. I mean, it's also true.
Well, now, if you practice the occult in Harry Potter, you're going to summon a demon. I don't know if you've seen that.
Well, see, that's what just is so irritating to me.
Sorry, guys.
Dean Radin. I don't know if you've ever read Dean Radin. He's a psychologist who writes a lot about parapsychological issues. And he'd often say to me, he says, Jeff, why are all the psychics always killed off in the movies? And I'm like, yeah, you're right, Dean. That's bad. And so what happens historically is the magician or the occult practitioner of the occult arts becomes literally demonized. And you kill them off in the story, or you paint them as some kind of evil, sinister, sorcerer or witch. And I don't believe that for a second. I think that's projection, but it's very effective projection. The condemnations work historically, and people like that are persecuted and even killed. So I just the bad stuff in Harry. I'm just riffing on Harry Potter. I grew up with, my kids grew up with those books. I watched all the movies, and I just don't think magic is necessarily bad. It can be, of course, like any other human thing, but it can also be used for good. And so that's kind of what that's what I'm trying to say.
Not only that, but how do we know that some of these abilities just isn't if you're taking a materialistic world view of the universe, how do you know that some of these psychic abilities simply isn't the next evolutionary step for humanity? And it seems like that's a logical question that you would ask yourself if you believe in this, in a materialistic worldview.
So first of all, materialists will just say these things don't happen.
So yeah, of course. They have a magic wand, right? Okay, it's gone. That's right. The evidence is gone.
Wand, yeah, and they just wave it away. But once you realize that these things do happen and that they're not simply fantasy or entertainment, people do begin to wonder about the relationship to evolutionary biology in particular, and whether they represent some kind of future human. However, this is something Frank I don't write about, but will someday. You also see the other direction. You see people who locate paranormal abilities on the opposite side of the evolutionary scale, right? So I'll just give you an example. One of the early creators of anthropology was a British Victorian gentleman by the name of E.B. Tylor. And he wrote this huge book called Primitive Culture, in which he developed this theory of animism. And his basic argument was that animism is the belief in spirits or gods, and that it's based on people having out-of-body experiences or having weird dreams around people dying. It's all hallucinatory for the most part, although there is a kind of question there. And it's about the savage or the primitive. And these were his words, not mine. But it was about what happened way back there, and then these beliefs developed into polytheism, and then they developed into monotheism, and then they eventually develop into European Christianity, and you eventually get good old glorious science. And so that was his evolutionary or developmental story. He knew that people claimed these abilities, but he put it at the opposite end of the evolutionary spectrum. Today, what's so interesting about today and popular culture today is they tend to put these abilities on the future end of the spectrum. And so, you get franchises like the X-Men, for example, which paranormal abilities are really signs of some kind of future evolution. But that's a kind of a new move, Frank. It's not new with the X-Men, by the way. They did not invent whatever they think. They did not invent that. That was already in place in England in the late 19th century. But you can do either one. You can move into the future, or you can move into the past with your interpretation.
So that's really fascinating what you just said. So the traditional way of looking at these extra abilities, pardon me, was that the further away we evolve from our primordial past, the lesser our paranormal abilities are, and that's progress.
Right.
That was kind of it, which is kind of neat if you consider, like, any kind of creation story. Like, we were close to God, we were in the heavenly court, then you're cast down. And the further you get from, like, the Garden of Eden, the more you're kind of cast out. But like you're saying, there's a reverse that's happening. And they're like, no, there's almost this rediscovery of human, this potential in us. And that is progress. It's not moving away from paradise. It's almost going back towards it again, kind of rediscovering, the inheritance of human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a reversal of the Adam and Eve story, actually.
Yeah, a complete reversal. That's pretty wild.
It's a total reversal. And, but this is what the evolutionary epic did or is doing to us. It's really changing the story. It's changing the game. And it's doing it in fits and starts. And, evolutionary biologists, if you talk to them, they're essentially materialists, but they don't really know what the mechanisms of evolution are. They'll tell you it's random mutation, but the more you look at it, you're just like, oh my God, DNA and the cell. This is not random. This is a freaking machine that's been somehow put together in an uncannily adaptive and intelligent way. So, I mean, this is the debate. This is where we go, I think, as we go down the rabbit hole.
So there are actually talks amongst the evolutionary geneticists, and there's a hypothesis that DNA is a perfect carrier of information.
Yeah.
And they were talking about, hey, if you want to go to another planet, why not just send your DNA and it can create, this monstrosity, I guess. But they were talking about if an advanced civilization, and again, this is a non-spiritual look at this, but if an advanced civilization came to humanity in the past, they may have altered our DNA and put like a code in it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's just pop science, if that's pseudoscience or what it is. But then again, there's folks with like, chairs and they're talking about it. And it
No,
just seems like,
yeah.
yes. Yeah. Sorry. Go on.
No, I don't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, please.
I mean,
Please.
that's 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? I mean,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
yeah,
It is.
the movie was about
Yeah.
this extraterrestrial monolith that appeared at different points in human evolution to guide it. And you know, geneticists do talk about the DNA code as letters. I mean,
Yeah.
it's literally letters. Well, not
Yeah,
literally,
it is.
it's
Yeah.
metaphorically letters, but yeah, I don't think it's pop science. I think it's certainly speculative science, and it's certainly science fiction. The science fiction writers pick this up. Someone like Greg Bear, for example, will talk about Darwin's radio, and essentially what he means is that the DNA is a kind of cosmic radio, and it picks up a signal, and that's really what's creating us, is this sort of cosmic signal. So that again is a very different way of thinking about.
What a terrifying solution to the Fermi paradox. Like the cosmic background microwave in the universe is altering our DNA, changing the course of humanity. Wow, that's kind of scary.
I don't think Greg Bear says that, but I mean, it is kind of like you're basically a receiver. You're being tuned by your cosmic environment in some way.
Well, isn't that what? Yeah, sorry. Well, let's see. I'm trying to think who to credit this to. So I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about the Fermi paradox, aliens, and all that. And one of them, they were talking about the DNA as well, and having a message, encoded in it. And then the host said, "You know what? I'm going to respect the geneticists when they finally clone a dinosaur." And he's like, "Until you bring me a dinosaur, I don't really know about what you're saying." But anyway, I thought that was cool.
There was a really funny moment when I was with Avi Loeb a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about some satellite we sent out into outer space, and I think it might have been James Webb or somebody's DNA was burnt, or his body was cremated, and we put the ashes in the satellite and sent it out to space. And Professor Loeb was like saying, "Wow, that was stupid." I mean, these aliens who get this satellite, they're going to think we're just like violent cretins, I mean, why would you burn DNA? I mean, that's like the dumbest thing in the world. You like preserve DNA. You like send it to another star. You don't cremate it, for goodness sake. And it was funny. It was really funny, but it gets to this same point you were talking about.
So the comparative religion professors in Alpha Centauri, the alien race, are saying, so the Earthlings have this bizarre practice where they'll build a spacecraft, and we think this symbolizes blah, 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 and they'll put ashes in it. It's like this just bizarre thing. I love it. You know what, though? I am just fascinated that you've had conversations with Avi Loeb. Like, I mean, that just kind of blows my mind. The connectiveness, I guess, of this community. Really, really cool. So I would like to jump to the Super Humanities.
Okay.
Yeah, jump to the Super Humanities, which again, folks, you can find a link to this in the show notes. I would encourage you to go over there and buy a copy of it. So how does the Super Humanities fit into your broader body of work? And is it a continuation of the ideas set forth in either Mutants and Mystics and the Serpent's Gift?
Yeah, I've been saying the same thing for 20 years, Frank. I'm not, as I joke.
I knew it. I uncovered it.
Yeah, I joke at the end of this book that really I just have one idea, and I'm just saying it over and over again. That idea it's really from Roads of Excess, by the way, which was before the Serpent's Gift. So it goes back to at least 2001. But the idea is basically that intellectuals and writers have really astonishing experiences, and that they create their ideas and their writing out of those altered states of consciousness. And that was the argument I was trying to make in Roads of Excess, but it was also, of course, the argument of Mutants and Mystics, which was essentially that when these artists and authors sit down to pen their science fiction novels or create their comics, they're actually working out of their own paranormal experiences, and they're turning these altered states of consciousness into fantasy, into images and storylines, which they know aren't literally true, and yet they're true because they're trying to express these experiences. In the Super Humanities, I'm really doing the same thing, and I'm saying, excuse me, what I'm saying is that what we think of as the humanities, so the study of literature, art, philosophy, religion, these sorts of pursuits, we think of these as sort of dusty old men, dead German white guys essentially, who now we have to read and learn things. I'm like, no, that's actually not true. If you look at the humanities, what you actually see is human beings who are having really remarkable altered states, and then they're coming up with their ideas, and then they're expressing them in these texts that they write, and then we read those texts and we reproduce those ideas and sometimes even those states. And that what the humanities really are is this engagement with these writers who are talking about this superhuman quality to the human being. And so the humanities really are the super humanities, just seen in a different way. And of course, today, the other thing that the book tries to do is, today, as we move into a more and more diverse and socially just production of knowledge, diversity should not just be about social identity or race or gender or sexuality. It should also be about different conceptions and experiences of reality. We can't just claim we're being diverse and then shove everybody into our Marxist materialist box. If we're going to be really diverse, we got to really reconsider whether reincarnation might be true, or whether the Buddha might have been right about the non-existence of the self or soul, or we have to take seriously the worldview of the indigenous First Nation that we're looking at, or the Mexican American shaman, or the community that uses psychedelics to access their deities and heal their people. We have to suddenly take all of that seriously. And by seriously, I mean we have to take it metaphysically and not just as another description that we're going to entertain in our infinite wisdom. And of course, I'm being sarcastic there. I think a lot of humanistic scholarship is tries to distance itself from the claims of whatever it's studying, and I'm saying no, don't do that. This gets really interesting when we don't do that, and so that's essentially the argument of the book, or couple of the arguments of the book.
Well, it's a dangerous idea. It's a dangerous idea to the paradigm that is currently, in force in colleges around the world right now.
Yeah.
And speaking, oh yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm used to being dangerous. I mean, that's sort of my MO, right? I mean, I on the other hand, I don't think I really am. I mean, this idea affirms what the humanities have always been doing and what they're doing today, but it says, look, you have to be more than this. And so it's not an either or. It's not either be concerned about social justice or transcendence. It's a both and. Be very, very interested in both of these things and then try to link them. And I'm not sure how to link them, by the way. But future writers and authors and artists and activists can figure out different ways to link them. And so by the super humanities, I don't mean some specific model of transcendence and some specific model of being social. I mean experimenting with different relationships between those two levels and creating new forms of knowledge that can better serve, future generations, our kids, and our kids' kids.
Especially our kids. I'm really excited to see what the world is going to look like by then. Well, speaking of dead German white guys, there's one in particular I would like to ask you about. Figures very prominently in the Super Humanities, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And you quote at length specifically, and you have to help me out with the pronunciation if I butcher it. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And when I was in college, I read Beyond Good and Evil. I didn't read this one, much to my great shame. I think I've never read Thus Spoke. But
it's a tough book, by the way, Frank.
Well, it's a creepy book, and it's a disturbing book because on every single page when I lied. So I was in high school whenever I tried to pick it up, and unlike a lot of budding intellectuals where the book managed to change their life, I was kind of intimidated by it because it's a book that makes you, for a first-time reader who's unfamiliar with this style, it makes you feel like you've already missed the bus. Like the bus is already missed. It's a little bit too late, but I've seen the Superman, figured in pop culture, in history, just various ways that it's been portrayed. And for one thing, I'm not really sure what the myth of Nietzsche is versus the construct that we have in our heads of him.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, what specific idea are you taking from Nietzsche in your work? And then the second part of the question I wanted to know is, so whenever I read Beyond Good and Evil, and you told me that as a philosopher and thinker, you like to endnote everything. So I can, read this book and see exactly where you got your ideas from. Yeah. Nietzsche doesn't really help us out like that.
Well, right.
So for the second part of the question, do you think what he was getting was revelatory in any kind of way?
Yeah. Okay. Those are good questions. Okay. So let me talk about Nietzsche. First of all, I hadn't read Nietzsche for my whole life.
I don't feel bad now.
Yeah. I read tons of Freud. I was very much a Freudian, and another dead white German, by the way. So I loved Sigmund Freud, and I read thousands and thousands of pages of Freud, but not Nietzsche. Even though Freud adored Nietzsche, by the way, adored Nietzsche. So what happened was, over the last few years, my graduate students have told me stories about how their lives were changed by reading Friedrich Nietzsche. And I was like, whoa. And by changed, I don't mean changed in some small way. I mean, often a life was literally saved by reading the
That's in the book too. Yeah.
Yeah.
For the viewers. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was like, what is going on here? Because I had inherited the stereotypes of Nietzsche that he's this like angry atheist, right? And he's just like, he's got a big handlebar mustache and he's pissed off and he's like,
the Third Reich and all of that.
Yeah. Okay. So I read him and I was like, holy smokes. First of all, he is an astonishing writer. You read him and it recreates the states, I think, that he's writing out of. The books I read anyway were very, very poetic. It turns out I read the late books, Ecce Homo and Beyond Good and Evil and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And so I got into it more and more, and I started to read what's going on here. And I did not find this angry atheist, Frank. I found someone who was constantly claiming his own states of deification, who claimed to be the god Dionysius, or who claimed to be the European Buddha. And he also was having uncanny, or what today we would call paranormal experiences. And he was writing, he was just laying it all out there. And I'm like, this is not what I was told was here. What is going on? And it turns out what happened was that in 1881, in the summer of 1881, he's wandering around Europe as was his wont, and he's staying in a village in Switzerland named Sils Maria. And he takes a walk, and in front of a boulder, he has essentially what I would call a mystical experience. And it involves two two later Nietzschean teachings. He referred to it in his journal afterwards as being 6,000 feet above man and time. And that one phrase encodes both teachings, because what comes out of it is this teaching of the Übermensch, or the evolving superhumans, which is really first articulated in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And he uses Darwin with this metaphor of the tightrope, that modern man is suspended on a tightrope, and behind him is the ape, and before him is the Übermensch that's on the horizon and coming. And we're just a transitional species between these two ends. His other teaching is the eternal recurrence of the same. And it's essentially this idea that time is circular and that everything repeats itself. And he didn't mean that in any kind of linear way. It wasn't that it goes in circles or forever. It's that time and space are actually bent back on themselves and everything repeats itself exactly as it is. And so I got fascinated in this figure because those ideas are all in the mystical literature and they're very religious. And the more I read about Nietzsche, the more I realized he wasn't this angry atheist. He, in fact, was all about affirming things. He wasn't just about denying things. He took apart things like no one had ever taken things apart. But he also wanted to put them back together. And so he had this constructive superhuman side to him, and he had this very humanistic kind of deconstructive side. And I was just like, wow, why aren't we talking about the superhuman here? Why aren't we just talking about this angry man who didn't exist? And so that's what I meant again by the superhumanities, is that Nietzsche, there's actually almost no one in the 19th century who's more important than Nietzsche for the humanities. But we only read him in the negative sense. We only read him as a naysayer. We do not read him as a yaysayer. We certainly don't read him for the Übermensch, because here's what happens, is he collapses probably from a brain tumor in 1859. Yeah, 1859. Yeah, somewhere in there. And I'm sorry, not 1889. He collapses in 1889 in January. And he's in a coma, basically, for the rest of his life. He's just in bed. His sister takes care of him. And his sister is a card-carrying Nazi and an anti-Semite, and married to one of the architects of what will much later become Nazi ideology. And it's his sister that essentially distorts Nietzsche's views and sells it to Hitler and Mussolini, and then the Nazi regime takes up Nietzsche as it was received through his sister. But Nietzsche himself is not responsible for this. Nietzsche is, in fact, completely unconscious and for the most part dead after 1889.
And he was against the idea of German myth-making and nationalism and national identities. And I think he mocked it too, right?
Yeah, and Nietzsche wasn't some saint. I don't want to dismiss. He said some really nasty things about women and slavery and everything else. On the other hand, he gets picked up by activists later on in the 20th century as one of the real architects of Black activism and different currents within liberal or progressive religion. The Superman stuff that you know so well and I know so well is two Cleveland kids, both Jewish, by the way, who, I'm sure they're reading about Nietzsche or they've heard of this.
There's
Nietzsche.
That mutant, again, there's the mutant connection that's coming out on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they create Superman in 1939. But that word had already been coined by George Bernard Shaw in 1903, who was indeed reading Nietzsche and wrote a whole play about man or Superman. So the term Superman, the category is just in American English from 1903 on. And this whole Superman comic book thing is really a World War II thing that then takes off and becomes its own thing. But it's always about being Jewish, by the way. It's very much about the Jewish immigrant as the alien. So yeah, my centering of Nietzsche, Frank, is simply he doesn't coin the word superhuman; it's used before him, but he is most responsible for inking the superhuman into the humanities. And I just want to acknowledge that, and I want people to struggle with that. I want them to read Nietzsche in both a positive and a critical light, and not just in a deconstructive light. So that's why he's central to the project. Not because I'm a Nietzschean or I think everything Nietzsche said was great or right. That's not my argument. My argument is that he really announces the Ubermensch or the superhuman, and he links it to evolutionary biology, like we were talking about earlier, in a really direct way. And the superhumans are coming on the future, just like you were saying. Although paranormal capacities were not central to the Ubermensch, although the ability to will backwards in time was, which I suppose is a paranormal capacity. That's a whole nother story, and a whole nother. But that's in the book too. Go read the book.
Oh yeah, sure, of course. As a matter of fact, I mean, I think I have a copy of it, the same one I bought when I was in high school.
Yeah, I don't mean now, Frank. I mean your readers. If you want to know,
Jeff told me to go and read it. I have to go read it now. So my copy is by it is translated by Walter Kaufman, and I hear that there's better and lesser versions of it out there. Do you have any kind of suggestions for our viewers if they want to get into Nietzsche?
Well, read the later Nietzsche. I mean, read Ecce Homo. I mean, the Kaufman translations is what I read. So that was the Ecce Homo, of course, is from the Gospel of John. It means behold the man, but it also implies deification. And Ecce Homo is Nietzsche's last book that he writes, and it's just fantastic. I mean, there literally is a section in it entitled something like "Why I Write Such Great Books." And it's just like really funny, but it's like, oh my God, he was serious, and oh my God, he was right. He does write great books. You know, we're still reading these great books. In fact, the other thing I would say about Nietzsche is go look at the Stanford translation series. Paul Loeb and Tinsley is the other scholar. They've been translating the journals, the Nachlass that was never translated into English and now is. So you can, or parts of it are, you can now read Nietzsche's private journals that he was writing around the Thus Spoke Zarathustra events. And he's talking about all of these things, Frank, in really blunt ways that are remarkable. Because they're private journals, you know, they're not published books.
Well, so kind of taking us out of the eternal recurrence and circular time, I realize that I think you have a class that's going to be coming up in about 15 minutes by my
I got about 15.
So let me ask you, do you have time for 2 more questions? Can I sneak them in? And I'm looking, and I figured I would just kind of get 2 more questions in before I let you go. So my first question is something that I took right out of the Super Humanities. And I am thinking about chapter 4, and I believe there is notation 27 at the very end of it, your end note.
Well, you read end notes.
Oh, yes, I do. Normally, if I get a book, I generally, I am a total nerd. I kind of start in the end notes. And for the viewers out there, that was probably Jeff's strongest selling point to me whenever I bought Mutants, because I went straight to the end notes and I said, holy hell, this guy has done his research. Oh my gosh. I mean, I could probably get lost just in there, but to kind of, to move us along here so you can get to your class to quote you, an unconscious of the future, end quote, is intentionally ambiguous. It is not clear to me whether such emerging abilities are pointing toward some future unconscious or are flowing back from a future consciousness that is only unconscious to us in the present. In any case, I no longer believe in the absoluteness of a one-way linear causal model of time. And there is a ton to unpack here, Jeff. Especially for the uninitiated like me, can you please provide an explanation of what you mean by abilities pointing towards some future unconscious? And what do you mean by you are rejecting the idea of a linear causal model of time?
Yeah. So the idea of, so there's two options. Okay, let me back up. So I've really been shaped here by people who have told me really dramatic stories of what most people would think of as precognition. In other words, they have a dream or they have some vision or a movie goes off in their head in the middle of the day, and then that exact thing happens the following day or the following week or something. Now, when I listen to these stories, I'll just tell you a quick story because it'll act as an example. I had a female colleague once tell me that at 10:06 in the morning, she had a movie just go off in her head, and some white smoke was appearing in her car, and her son was screaming in the back of the car in the car seat. And she had just sent her young son to the zoo with a nanny, and so this was an obviously very upsetting vision. This was in broad daylight. There's a movie going off in her head. There was nothing metaphorical about it. It was very, very real, very specific. And so it just scared the hell out of her. She calls her nanny and she tells her nanny to drive back to the house safely, which she does, and they get back fine. The next day, the kid wants to go back to the zoo, of course. So the mother gets in the car and takes him, and she's in a pretty bad car accident. And the other person in the other car called the husband because the woman was injured, and it came in at 10:08. So the accident was at 10:06. And when the accident happened, of course, the airbags went off and the car filled up with white powder, which was the white smoke of her earlier vision. Okay, so that's the story. Now, there are hundreds of those. There are thousands of those. They happen all the time. But when you think about that story, what you don't know is whether the mother on day one was precognizing herself on day two, or whether the mother on day two was sending a signal back to the mother on day one to warn her. You don't know. But what you know is that the mother on day one is misreading what's happening. You know, she thinks it's a kind of clairvoyance when it's actually precognition. But she doesn't know that. And by acting on it, she in fact causes it. Right? So she's in this time loop, as Eric Wargo would call it. And so I've heard too many stories like that from like close friends, students. I know these people aren't pulling my leg. I know these things happen. And so to me, it really could be the fact that our abilities are pointing towards some kind of future humanity, but it could also be that our future humanity is sending signals back to us and kind of edging us, nudging us forward. You know, I don't think we can tell from where we're at. I think it is largely unconscious, by which I don't mean there's some mysterious thing called the unconscious. I mean, we're just not aware of what's happening. And by not being aware of it, we're helping to cause it, like this mother. So that's what I mean, Frank. I've also been really influenced by a writer named Eric Wargo, who I just referenced, who writes about these instances and writes about what he calls time loops, these sort of causal loops that he thinks lie at the core of creativity and our dream life.
I figured, so everybody, that was Dr. Jeff Kripal. Do you have any closing words for us, Jeff, before we head out of here?
No, other than thank you for reading the book. I mean, not every interviewer is so well informed and asks such questions, I assure you.
Well, thank you very much. That really means a whole lot to me. And what I aspire to do at Reader's Labyrinth is to take a good book, especially if it's one that I enjoyed, and let potential viewers find your book, buy your book, so they can experience the same thing. Jeff, it was lovely having you on here, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.